So I was asked to focus on different pieces of our history. And so what I decided to do was sandwich a bad story with two good stories. So maybe it'll even out as we go forward. So some of you have seen me present, and I'm going to share with you just a little bit from what I often spend a lot of time on, and that's our earlier history. So if you'll bear with me, we're going to go through some history fairly quickly, and then settle into the bad story. But first, since you are focusing on education opportunity, it seems like a good place to start is to know, when did education opportunity to become a matter of constitution for us here in North Carolina? We've had 3 constitutions, and it's the second one, North Carolina Constitution of 1868, where we start off thinking about education opportunity. And this Constitution is not just stuck on a shelf somewhere with no lasting importance. What our Supreme Court has said is that the intent and purpose of the framers of the 1970 Constitution was to revise editorially only the 1868 Constitution. So what we work with now is based largely on what we got in 1868, and that's especially true in education. So I want to tell you just a little bit more about what happened in 1868 before moving into the bad story. So first, there's always something leading up to something like a constitutional convention, and I'm going to assume it's not news for you to note that things weren't going so well in North Carolina right after the Civil War. So one of the things that those who were continuing to be in control, even though it was pretty clear their point of view was not accepted anymore, but in 1866, they abolished the positions of the state superintendent and the treasurer of the literary fund, the only 2 positions we had for the state. It also said that the literary fund, those funds could now be used for any purpose whatsoever, wiping out our education funds. And it removed local requirements for providing public schools. So we had been in a process of building schools, and it was shut down in 1866. So that's what's happening coming into this constitutional convention. And indeed, one of the fathers of education, we would call him Calvin Wiley, was deeply distressed about what was going on. And he sent a circular all across North Carolina. These are one of the many archived documents that you can get. And I know you can't see all of this print, so I'll move on to the next slide. And on this slide, we're also going to test the audio. So we'll hopefully it won't hurt your ears. We'll see if you can hear it, though.
The state is now beginning a new career, and under many and sore discouragements. The common schools, the greatest temporal interest of the people, are suspended, and we are in danger of falling into that lethargy which many years ago characterized our state, though always great in her resources.
So hearing, can you hear that? And so indeed, the last step they took before the Constitutional Convention was to allow locals to do something. You could, as a local level, and notice, look at these bottom lines here. So it was going to be a poll tax on white male inhabitants to be wholly appropriated to the use of public schools for all the white children after the Civil War. And so by the time of the 1868 Constitutional Convention, the Military Reconstructions Act, Congress, dictated that we have a different group of people making decisions for North Carolina. And so one of those people is Samuel Stanford Ashley. He was a carpetbagger. And so if you haven't seen him a lot in history books, that would be your first reason to know why you haven't heard about him. So he comes to us from Rhode Island and Massachusetts. And this phrase here that started in the Constitution of 1868 in Article 1, Section 27, the people have a right to the privilege of education, and it is the duty of the state to guard and maintain that right. Where'd that come from? Well, Ashley is standing on the floor of the convention. They're debating the Declaration of Rights, and he suggests this as an amendment. We're the only state in the country to have this in our Declaration of Rights. In fact, we're the only state in the country to have any right of education in the Declaration of Rights. Think about that. Think about the power of saying this is one of the fundamental rights that we have said in North Carolina. And so what happened to this provision? Well, here it is. Hasn't changed at all. Here's another part of what happened in 1868. Ashley was chair of the education section that was putting together the provisions on education to go in the Constitution. He asked to make some revisions on the floor, so we see his work once again. And this is how we get the provision in our Constitution that provides for a general and uniform system of public schools. And how does that matter? Well, this is what our court said in 1997. We conclude that these two provisions, the right to a privilege of public education and a general and uniform system of free schools, combine to guarantee every child of the state an opportunity to receive a sound basic education in our public schools. Both from 1868 and both actually from Ashley. And so if we take that provision, here's another thing that the court said in 1997. The time this provision was originally written in 1868, the intent of the framers was that every child have a fundamental right to a sound basic education which would prepare the child to participate fully in his society as it existed in his or her lifetime. And that says it pretty well, doesn't it? That's what you're here for today. And we've essentially had this in place since 1868. And here's the language, the way it looked there. We've changed it a little bit. We took out some of the verbiage around where tuition shall be free of charge and just called it free public schools. And we actually strengthened it. Equal opportunity shall be provided for all students. So these provisions not only combine to create our sound basic education, but I would challenge you to find a constitution anywhere in the country as strong as ours. So when we're looking for the problem, it's not our Constitution. If we're looking for people who have been a part of North Carolina, who have made us have something strong in place, that's something that we can celebrate as we move forward. And so Ashley, he actually, in addition to being a delegate at the Constitutional Convention, he becomes our first state superintendent of public instruction, elected state superintendent. He creates the first set of laws, 1869, that's taken over to the General Assembly. And if you look in some of those provisions about like what we teach in our schools, you'll see some language that comes all the way back from 1869 in Ashley. I didn't share with you some about James Walker Hood, who is another delegate, and more stories for another day. But in addition to being, I heard some of the earlier comments about the problems with segregation. As the Constitution was being written, there were proposals to provide for separate schools. And he spoke strongly, powerfully against that, and that's why we didn't have that in our Constitution in 1868. He then became the assistant superintendent of colored schools from 1868 to 1870. And why only 2 years? Well, the people who had been in charge before the Constitutional Convention came back into charge, and they took away a salary. So we had 2 years, 1868, 1870, where we were trying to do a lot of things. His job was trying to find schools for blacks. He was pulling as any funds that he could from the Freedmen's Bureau or other sources that might still be available. He was traveling until they cut his travel budget. But these are heroes that come to us from our past. W.B. Du Bois, who has studied this, who had studied this extensively over not only North Carolina but the South, said it's fair to say that the Negro carpetbag governments established the public schools of the South. And it's a fair statement because what happened in North Carolina with Ashley and Hood was happening all over the South. And it was a way we were approaching things back in 1868 to 1870. So what happened? Well, the later 1800s is full of issues around power and politics. And so we're going to start with that to lead into the 19th century. So let's start with voting, because that's part of where power lies, isn't it? So here's, of course, women aren't voting. So we're just looking at white and black males. But look here at these numbers. So here is the white male line, starting in 1880. It's around 81%, goes up to 86%, down to 78%, up to 87%. Look at the black male line. 86%, 98%. Just pause for that. 98%. 68%, 64%. This is the period. This is in the 88, 92 elections. There's a lot of voter intimidation going on then. And up here to 85. So that's a lot of power being held by black males. And that was did not well suit some people in North Carolina. And so they wanted to come up with a strategy for reducing that power. So one thing we might look at is our congressional districts. This is what it looked like from 1868 to 1872, during that sort of golden period where we were really moving towards some promising options. You'll notice it looks pretty much like a little puzzle piece, right? If you were a child, you could block this up into 7 neat sections, put it back together. So look what happens. That's 1872 to 1883. And here we are in 1891 to 1901. Y'all know the reason for this, right? You know you're gerrymandering enough to know that they successfully put all blacks essentially into this second, not all, but they were able to carve out a majority black district here in the second to minimize the impact of blacks on all other districts in North Carolina. And essentially what they were saying was, if you're a white politician in the second district, just give it up, because we're not going to try and win there. We're just going to try and win in all the other districts. That's the gerrymandering strategy. You give up in a small place in order to get your victories everywhere else. So here's an interesting thing about that. Wayne County was a home of Charles B. Aycock, and he wasn't happy to just go home. He wanted to run for state office, and he knew that this would now be impossible with things happening the way they were in his district. And so racial politics became a very important part of what Charles B. Aycock looked at. And this is part of his nomination speech for governor.
We have taught them much in the past 2 years in the University of White Supremacy. We will graduate them in August next with a diploma that will entitle them to form a genuine white man's party. Then we shall have no more revolutions in Wilmington. We shall have no more dead and wounded Negroes on the streets, because we shall have good government in the state and peace everywhere. But to do this, we must disfranchise the Negro. The amendment to the Constitution is presented in solution of the problem. The Democratic Party knows the truth. It is certain that the unlettered white man is more capable of government than the Negro. But the opponents of the amendment attack it on another ground. They say that every child who comes of age after 1908, white and black, must be able to read and write before he can vote. This is true. The schools are open and will be for 4 or more months every year from now to 1908. The white child under 13 who will not learn to read and write in the next 8 years will be without excuse. I tell you that the prosperity and the glory of our grand old state are to be more advanced by this clause than by any other one thing. Speak the truth. Tell it in Gath. Tell it in the streets of Ascalon, that universal education of the white children of North Carolina will send us forward in a bound in the race with the world. With the adoption of this amendment after 1908, there will be no state in the Union with a larger percentage of boys and girls who can read and write, and no state will rush forward with more celerity or certainty than conservative old North Carolina.
So this is the literacy test. So part of his campaign as governor focused on having a constitutional amendment for a literacy test. This would require every person presenting himself for registration shall be able to read and write any section of the Constitution in the English language. What you heard him referring to is the grandfather clause. So if you came from a lineage who could vote, you could still vote until 1908, and then you would have to be able to read. And so this was the idea, and this was important to Aycock, was he was going to use this for two purposes. One, he was going to reduce male voting, black male voting, and two, he was going to increase white children's literacy. So let's see what happened. So North Carolina illiteracy rates in 1890, there were black males was 53%, 19% for white males. That's a pretty good indication that this sort of strategy would work if what you're trying to do is keep people from going to the polls. And in fact, this is what happened. So here are the percentages. You saw these earlier, going up to the 98%. Coming down here, we go from the 67% to 0. 0. So that's a combination of the literacy test and voter intimidation. So what about the literacy campaign? Here's one of the clips.
Next Monday will be an important day in Anson, the County Board of Education having decreed that all the public schools of the county shall open their doors that day. It is a painful truth that many of our people have not, in the past, taken that lively interest in public education which its important demands. The white parents of the county should be informed that their children, who come of age after 1908, cannot vote unless they can read and write. Surely there is no white parent in Anson County who wishes to see his little boy grow to manhood and not have the privilege of casting a ballot for the party of his choice. The schools are provided for them, and there should be such a strong public sentiment developed that it will be practically impossible for any man to allow his children to grow up in utter ignorance.
So this campaign went on across the state. It was one of our biggest education campaigns we've ever had. James Y. Joyner was state superintendent during this time period, and he was one of the lead organizers of the campaign. So you see in here some of the explanations of some of the activities that he has going on, going out to arrange for speakers to come anywhere that there was an opportunity to talk about the importance of public education. Here's some of the dates of all of his listings of the speakers and all the efforts that they've been making. And here's a response back from one of the people that responded to that campaign survey.
The majority of the Republicans and a great many Democrats oppose everything we undertake to do. They criticize the methods of the board and the work of the superintendent and find fault with the law. If it would suit you and the Honorable Charles B. Aycock to speak to the people of this county at the courthouse in Robbinsville on the first Monday in July, I think we could give you a good crowd. If you decide to do this, I would suggest that you have several posters printed and sent to me.
And so you see, you can find these news clippings everywhere from this time period of all of these different events that he went to, and how this was truly a statewide effort. He also, Joyner worked with the local superintendents, and this is an example of that. This was a state association of the county superintendents that was held in September 4 of 1907. And I want to show you the inside of the program, and you'll see a number of things that look like the kinds of things that people working in schools would think about. How to help the school committeemen secure the best teacher for their school. We're still thinking about that one, right? Let me point out another one here, and it's this thing here. The best method of collecting and managing the special tax fund. This was a big campaign to increase the local tax fund. So you'll notice, go from 7 to 402 in 1906, and by 1913 we have over 1,500. So what do you think local tax funds are? What is that accomplishing? Well, local tax fund would mean for a particular locality, and that's when we can pretty quickly segregate by whites and blacks. And so this was a way for whites to provide additional support to their schools, was through local tax funds. And we utilized that well during this time period. And this is out of one of the annual reports. This would have been reported on by Joyner to the state, as he was required to report each year. In the newly established local tax districts, of course, the school term has been greatly lengthened and in many instances doubled. So remember, we're still working at getting complete terms. So this was a huge difference in educational opportunity for kids, whether they lived in a local tax district. Remember people talking about geography before, there's geography then as well. The literacy test was challenged in the court. The North Carolina Supreme Court said in 1936, it would not be amiss to say that this constitutional amendment providing for an educational test brought light out of darkness as to education for all the people of the state. Religious, educational, and material uplift went forward by leaps and bounds. I want to share with you one more thing from J.Y. Joyner. This was a letter he sent to superintendents. Whoops. Sorry. The Negro schools can be run for much less expense and should be. In most places, it does not take more than 1/4 as much to run the Negro schools as it does to run the white schools for about the same number of children. The salaries paid teachers are very properly much smaller. The houses are cheaper. The number of teachers smaller. If quietly managed, the Negroes will give no trouble about it. So this is the way our appropriations looked. For black students, it was about $2 a student. For whites, it was $5.27. So you might have heard this quote before of Charles Brantley Aycock. This is a picture that was actually, it was like a sticker that were sent out to children in the schools to affix inside the textbooks. And it says, his last words to his people, equal, that is the word, the equal right of every child born on earth to have the opportunity to burgeon out all that is there within him. Sounds a little different when you hear all the facts. So before we move on to my good story, I want to come back to this map. So you have available, I think, these maps of a graphic look at counties in need. If you've got one handy, I encourage you to compare it to that second district that existed then. And what I can tell you is that all of those that were in the second district, the vast majority are in the highest need. 2 are in the next category of need. History continues. So for this next part, I want to ask first, how many of you know the Jeans teachers? Okay, so if you're going to look at issues around racial equality, you want to get to know the Jeans teachers. They're some of the most phenomenal people in our history. And here's what happened. The Jeans Fund was named for a Quaker woman who, back here in the teens, gave over $1 million, which, think about that, to this issue of providing highly skilled black teachers to assist in the education of black children. And the state of North Carolina would have had some role in trying to secure these teachers, and in fact, the administrator at the state level would have been going around to the superintendents, encouraging them to hire these teachers. And the teachers were just kind of portrayed in the white community as sort of vocational ed teachers, so people who would just sort of keep things going. But they actually had a much larger role, and they had a role in community organizing. So let me tell you a little bit more about them. So this was the first Jeans teacher, Virginia Estelle Randolph, and she was actually in Virginia. And I can't improve on the quote, so I'm going to just read it. Here was a teacher who thought of her work in terms of the welfare of the whole community, and of the school as an agency to help the people to live better, to work with more skill and intelligence, and to do it in the spirit of neighborliness. Patience and faith, tact, kindliness, good humor, and a humility that shows itself in her willingness to learn from others, and a quiet tenacity of purposes that overcomes all difficulties. So that's how this got started. And in North Carolina, we actually had a lot of genes teachers. Only Virginia had more genes teachers than we did. And so as they came into communities, they worked on all sorts of things, and I'm going to show you a couple of things, but I want to give you a little bit more background. I bet more of you have heard of the Rosenwald schools. Okay, here's the connection. So the way the Rosenwald schools worked is a black community would have to say, we're willing to engage in this process. We're willing to put something into the process. The white school board has to agree to this, and then they move forward. And what was important about this is that once a Rosenwald school was built under these conditions, that school was a part of the white public school system. And it was guaranteed to have the same quality of teachers and of resources, materials that were available to the white school. So there was a deal being struck here. But who's the one who lets black communities know that this exists? It was the genes teachers. This is what they did. So I'm going to tell you about one of the genes teachers in North Carolina. And because their work was not valued, it's hard to get a lot of the information. But Carrie Jordan's, we do have a copy of her annual report. And again, I'm just going to use these quotes. This is from her annual report to the state. So part of what she does is inspect the conditions of schools. We found many of the school houses were in such poor condition that they were really unfit for use. By explaining to the patrons in these communities the splendid offer of Mr. Rosenwald to assist them in obtaining new buildings, much interest was aroused. Of course, it has meant hard work, many community meetings on weekends and evenings, with quite a few educational rallies held on Sundays. That's how the work got done. The meetings held in this connection served a dual purpose, securing new buildings and giving opportunity to stress important matters pertaining to education and homemaking. Here's the Russell School in Durham, one of the Rosenwald schools. North Carolina had more genes teachers than any other state other than Virginia. North Carolina had more Rosenwald schools than any other state. Those two statistics go hand in hand. And so that's my good story. When you put it right after the bad story, I find it even more striking that people were willing to keep working within the system and still trying to find a way to make it work instead of leaving. It would have made all the sense in the world to me that you would have just tried to find another way. And so you have three stories. Two are of people trying to make things work, and they had success. So I also want to leave with this notion. So here's what I had shown you before. And maybe you haven't thought that much about history of that time period, and maybe you don't have a clear sense of this. But I think it's actually important that we do understand our history and understand how things happened. And I want to juxtapose this with another quote. This is out of the Pearsall Plan in 1956. So the Pearsall Plan was about coming up with a state solution to not having to integrate our schools. And this is just in the introductory passages. The white race has been almost wholly responsible for the creation, development, and support of an education system which has been and is now educating the Negro children of the state, all of them. That's a little bit in contrast, isn't it? But this is a story that's been told. I mean, if you want to do your history, you have to go back to the you have to go to the archives and find the report that Carrie Jordan wrote to the state about what she was doing, because it's not written in a book. This is what you get if you just want to go to the books. So I want to just encourage you as a part of your process that getting a sense of the contributions that have been made by blacks and whites working together, by coalitions forming, is critical to thinking about what your opportunities are as you move forward.